Welcome to the Cognitive Advantage Podcast, where you will gain insights and advice to help you leverage the full cognitive talent of your team, enhance employee engagement, and maximize your results and impact. Well, welcome back to the Cognitive Advantage Podcast. Last time we busted the myths of normal brains and established that cognitive diversity is a baseline reality. Our broader goal is to help leaders leverage the full cognitive capability of their teams, enhance employee engagement, and ultimately maximize their results and impact. Sira, at the end of our last session, you said the biggest opportunity for immediate impact is meetings. Why start there?
Yes, it's because meetings are where cognitive diversity shows up most visibly and where we waste so much potential. Mm-hmm. Most meetings are designed for one brain type, the fast processors who think out loud.
So, what's the real cost of what we're talking about? What's the impact here?
Sure. So last time we talked about just the quantity, right, of folks who are actually outside of this neurotypical or this non-existent average brain. And it's at least 75% or more of your team who needs additional processing time. And traditional meetings waste the majority then of your employees' cognitive potential. We're losing a kind of silent brilliance, right? Those high value insights that never get shared because of poor meeting design.
Well, this is kind of an area from a leadership perspective and something, having, run a lot of meetings. This isn't about being nice to different types of people. This is, speaking my language, about business performance.
Exactly. This is about optimization strategy, not accommodation thinking. Because there is no typical brain, right? That's a non-existent average that we've been designing systems around. And when we realize cognitive diversity is the baseline reality, everyone benefits when we design meetings that work for how brains actually function.
Right.
So I can paint like the picture of why most meetings fail. Right. Cognitive diversity. There's really three major systemic problems.
Okay, so let's start with the first one.
Speed bias. We favor quick responses over thoughtful analysis. So the person who speaks first gets heard, but the person who thinks deepest might actually have the strategic insight that prevents costly mistakes.
And from my social style works, and, I've seen this constantly, and I'll even go a step further. I mean, I am that guy that spoke fast. I am that guy that spoke first. I am that guy that, especially early in my career, may have probably over-controlled some conversations, and the analytical personality often gets labeled as slow when they're doing risk assessment. And it's something that I came to appreciate a lot more as my career went on, and especially in the insurance business, because ultimately that risk assessment ultimately saves organizations significant money. It reduces risk, while the driver, myself, the large expressive, the talker, is pushing for a decision to move on when we might not be organizationally at a point to move on.
That's exactly right. And that second problem is the extroversion assumption. Right? That we equate verbal participation with deep engagement. But research actually shows that introverts often generate more creative ideas when they have enough processing time.
Yeah, I often have thought about it from a perspective, and please, I'd love your thoughts on this, is that extroverts think out loud and introverts think inside their head. Is that fair? Is that realistic?
Yes. Yeah. The ability to think and speak almost at the same time is a classic extrovert quality.
Yeah.
And introverts kind of do them side by side, right? We think, process, interpret, analyze, and that's deep processing that occurs before we're able to then communicate what we've learned from all of that processing. So it's not more superficial, which tends to be the extroverted ways, like you take in a few data points and are able to comment on that, versus extroversion where you're actually taking in a large number of data points, finding connections, and then, right, you're articulating your analysis.
So what about people who are actively listening and thinking, but not necessarily speaking up immediately?
That is the third problem. That is a one size fits all structure.
Yeah.
And we design agendas that work for nobody optimally.
Mhm.
The fast processors can get bored, the deep processors get overwhelmed. The sensitive processors are reading team dynamics that could improve the whole meeting if we just asked.
Yeah, I'm smiling because you started off with the fast processors get bored, and yeah, I've often attributed that just to me, trying to think of how I want to phrase this, but I don't know if I just whether it's a focus issue or whether I just don't have the patience for waiting. And again, I've evolved from that, but that's just a more of a generic experience that I've had. But what is the, hidden cost of this?
Cognitive overwhelm is when processing styles clash with meeting pace, missing pattern recognition from the analytical processors. This is what some research calls multitasking fatigue. It's
Mhm.
when people try to keep up with meeting styles that don't match their cognitive processing style. Performance actually gets worse across all brain types.
So even the people that the current systems seem designed for, me, aren't, getting optimal results. And I'm thinking that, but I'm also experiencing it because I know that there's components of meetings which suit me, and there's components of meetings which don't, and they're always bundled together. So I'm most engaged in some parts of a meeting, but not in others.
Yes, everyone has environments where they thrive and environments where they struggle. And the world of work has just been designed for one tiny way of working, which it is why it feels normal to some, and it's honestly a very small right percentage of your organization is where that feels normal, and then it's completely abnormal for others.
I know from a number of conversations we've had, and, again, because meetings form such a large part of our day and our business life, and it's something you're very passionate about. If we're going to redesign meetings for cognitive diversity, kind of where do we start and how do we maximize the value for all, or at least more importantly, move in the right direction?
Yeah, absolutely. It really starts before the meeting even begins with pre-meeting design principles that set everyone up for success.
So, again, I'm a practical guy. So, what does this look like practically?
Sure. Really simple. An agenda, have one, but then also allowing for some processing time with that agenda and what the topics are for that meeting. So even just sending materials out, the simplest agenda, really just a few bullet points even can be enough to help someone prepare, right, to wrap their mind around, right, as we put it, what's at hand, right, the task at hand. So 24 to 48 hours in advance.
Mhm.
And that's not, again, accommodating slow people. It's about leveraging the strategic thinking that comes from preparation time.
Yeah, it's funny that you start there because I guess two things. One is I had a policy, a rule, especially towards the end of my career when I was leading large teams, is if there was no agenda, I didn't go. That was number one because to me that was talk to a lack of structure and lack of preparation. But I recently read a story in Fortune magazine, and it was an interview of Jamie Dimon of the CEO of JP Morgan, who, among other things, stressed how meetings must have an agenda with everyone reading the materials in advance. Because if there wasn't an agenda, he wasn't going. And more importantly, he stressed with teams that it had to happen. And, I coach my clients to this, but found very often that, teams didn't always come prepared. So you can provide the agenda, but if they don't do the pre-work, it's almost a waste of time. How do you feel about this mandate and how do you align that with your advice?
Sure. Multiple input channels, right? We need like pre-meeting input forms for introverts and deep processors. We need clear objectives that distinguish between meetings that are about information sharing,
Mm.
about brainstorming versus decision making meetings. Right? Different meeting types require different cognitive approaches. And most of the time, what we're doing is try to shove all of those approaches into a single meeting.
So can you give me some specific, say facilitation strategies?
Sure. Yeah. One I like, again, really simple, cost effective, is the 60-second rule. And that's where you pause after asking a question to the group to allow some processing time. We can also round robin contributions, right, to ensure that all of the voices, including the analytical voices, are heard. Written before verbal, right, which is a way of collecting initial thoughts in writing before discussion, just using sticky notes in the meeting. So just a moment to let everybody get out their ideas, whatever they're thinking, positive, negative, neutral, and to have the ability to process and then articulate that on a note, which we then go around and discuss.
I love that last one because it maybe levels the playing field a little bit between, fast and deep processors and, mixes up the standard approach. But, I'm smiling because it also is something that I've seen many times in workshops where you get an external facilitator, they come in and they put up the flip charts and you put sticky notes and you're able to think and process. And I often walked away from those meetings thinking that was a really valuable exercise. It forced me to think differently and engage the team differently. But I was actually thinking of myself, and I'm thinking now, I watched how everybody got engaged more so than many meetings. And, over my career, I've learned to pause and give more time to process and asking or and understanding the importance of soliciting input, especially those who maybe weren't as active in meetings. Is this a good approach as well?
Absolutely. And it's because most leaders miss energy management as part of the equation. You need to read the cognitive load of the room. You just need to understand that there are different cognitive loads and cognitive capacities in the room. And, the good news is that you don't have to guess, right? When you are creating an environment where it's normal to ask these things, just ask. Right? Like, how's everyone's energy level? Do we need a processing break? Sharing that structure in advance to show someone, okay, it looks like we're going to do an hour and a half block of this, but I'm going to need a break in here. Like, let me ask if we can add a 5-minute right break in between then. So you're getting feedback from the group, from every participant.
Practical Tony has a question, which is, we're talking, if we think about decision making, how do we balance speed? Because, there's only so much time, we got to get stuff done, and thoughtfulness, because that's kind of how I'll frame what you've been talking about.
So we distinguish between what can be a fast decision
Mhm.
and what is a strategic decision. And strategic is it's a lot of complication, there's complexity, there's first, second, third order effects, right, with so implications beyond just the immediate. And sometimes you need to push pace, but for strategic and complex decisions, we need to allow reflection time to be able to construct the immediate impact, right? The near term or short term impact, and then the longer term, longer scale impacts. And that pattern recognition integration is what we're talking about, right? Where we create space for systems thinkers to contribute. Again, the ones who are able to see the opportunity and assess risk. And risk assessment balance, right, where you're leveraging both intuitive and analytical perspectives, is how we come up with the best answers.
This kind of connects a little bit with the social style work, and we've talked, a lot about some of the work I
Yeah.
do in that area. But it talks about how different personalities contribute differently to decision making.
Yes. And again, want to be very clear that we're not accommodating, right, differences. Differences are the baseline reality, right? There is no average brain. We are leveraging all of our unique advantages for better outcomes.
In our past chats, you mentioned distinguishing between different meeting types. Can you break down a little bit? I think you called it the Berkman color method that you work with.
Yes. So I'm a certified Berkman method consultant. And like social styles, is a 4-color framework.
Okay.
And we have four distinct meeting types based on this framework, and each is optimized for the different cognitive strengths.
Well, my daughter says blue, is my favorite, is my best color. So why don't we start with blue?
So, blue meetings are for data analysis focus, strategic planning, problem analysis, detailed review. When I walk into a blue meeting, I get to expand. There's space for ideas to emerge. No decisions made is an important part of this because that can actually shrink, right, our ability to think outside of the box and think creatively and think longer term when we're solutioning. So the brain type optimization means analytical processors lead, right, these blue meetings, and intuitive processors who need structure, right, are favored in these meetings. And the preparation strategy is that you have materials that are sent in advance and that there's usually a longer time block, and we include processing breaks.
Mhm.
And again, like where possible, do not have any decisions made in this meeting. We are preparing, right, for decisions, but those happen in the red meeting.
So something you just said there, as you were starting to explain it, and you talked about, these are, for data analysis and so forth. The first thing I thought about was, how do I make sure, though, that that analytic individual is going to speak up? But what you said, that it's led by an analytic processor. How important is that in the process?
Yeah, I think it's in identifying or codifying, right, our meetings in this way that allows for natural leadership, like without a title,
Mhm.
right, to emerge, and that people can then lean into their strengths. And then you're again creating this flatter, more democratized, and psychologically safe environment where you are going to get, better ideas, and people who may not have always contributed before because they're overwhelmed with fast processing, that they have the opportunity to contribute their best thinking, right, in an environment that is specifically structured for it.
Yeah. I'm just keep on reflecting and thinking, I love the concept of the meeting and the brainstorming and the data analysis, but having it led by that, analytic processor, I think is going to be, to me, the critical part of it, because they're going to identify with the people that they want to be speaking up the most. And I think that's a great idea. But what about the red meetings?
Yes. So red meetings are the opposite of blue meetings. In the four color framework, red is
Okay.
opposite blue and green
Okay.
is opposite yellow.
Okay.
And red meetings are then where blue meetings are exploratory, right? And big and spacious, right? No decisions made. Red meetings are action and results focused. So we are going to make decisions in this meeting. And when I show up to a red meeting, I know what time it is. It's time to decide, not debate. So we're getting task assignments, progress updates, obviously a place where, the fast processors thrive, and still analytical processors need pre-work, and just even that color coding. Like when your brain understands what's expected of it, it can
Mhm.
relax into the task at hand instead of bracing for the unexpected, and again shrinking the cognitive capacity, right, for not knowing and immediately being under stress. So still send specific questions 24 hours in advance for the deep processor. You're like, we need you to arrive ready to decide on these three things. I think timers are a great thing to introduce in a red meeting, because you've got people who are still going to want to talk and debate and such. We're talking about this for X amount of time, and then we're moving to decision mode. But allow still written input first, right? Get that equalizer. All right, your ideas go on a sticky note. And yeah, when there is debate, right, that still emerges as present and necessary, we still don't do that in a red meeting. We don't take over a red meeting with debate and collaboration and buy-in. We save that for the green meeting.
I still am curious, if I'm leading a red meeting, which is probably a lot of the meetings I led over the years. I still need to make sure, though, that I'm drawing in the input from the deeper processors. As much as they have been, directed by having a red meeting, that they're supposed to come up with ideas, I still got to draw them out. Is that true? Or is it assumed by the fact that they're attending a red meeting that they've got pre-reading and that they need to come prepared to engage?
It is probably in the beginning something that you would still need to actively do within a meeting because brains are getting used to it. And
Right.
if this is a new change, right, for your organization, in the immediate response in most people's brain, right, is threat. This is not something I'm used to doing or like doing or have easily do. And if you're not used to preparing, 24 to 48 hours in advance, if these structural pieces are not there, then there is a bit of resistance. It can be totally unconscious too, right? Somebody could want, right, to show up, but the unconscious mind is
Mhm.
controlling quite a bit of how we actually show up. So yes, absolutely still advantageous and wise to level set at the beginning of a meeting. And that is partly
Good
why,
point.
the sticky note process, right, is like, what this is how we're going to solicit ideas so that people aren't thinking plus verbalizing. They're thinking plus writing it down, less
Right.
energy consumption there.
Yeah. So how are green meetings different?
Green meetings are for collaboration, consensus building. It's where you get to debate right on what we're doing and why we're doing it and who should be a part of it. So they're also team building and relationship focused discussions. Green meetings should be used also for conflict resolution. Collaborative processors, they contribute significantly. Drivers are going to need clear outcomes. What are we just talking, or are we doing something with this talk?
Yeah, what's the purpose
And
of today? Exactly. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
All right.
so, a strategy to make green meetings work is that you are using your one on one, right? Check ins before group discussion
Good
to
point.
help, again, prepare people for what's going to happen in a green meeting, which, again, if this is new for your organization, can be a little off putting that no, we actually are going to be voicing all of our concerns here. And it's not personal, but somebody may disagree with you. So you're setting those norms and the expectations, which again, if you're not used to doing that in your org, can put people's brains into a threat state. And so what you're doing with, again, your one-on-one meeting and the materials that you prep in advance is you're helping create psychological safety and letting everybody know that like this is about gathering multiple perspectives and we want yours.
Yeah, I feel like I did some of this. I'll even call it in an unconsciously incompetent way. And I mean by what I mean by that is that there was times when I was having a meeting and we were discussing something in detail, and we were kind of getting to a resolution. It could be a combination of green and red and blue, whatever. But I knew there was people that I needed to get them to speak up in the meeting, and so I would actually meet with them before and say, okay, let's talk a little bit about your thoughts on this. You really have a great input. I really need you to speak up. What can I do to help make you feel comfortable to bring that idea forward? And some of it was a coaching and development perspective, but some of it was really just dealing with that deep processor who maybe was not sure how to bring forward their views and in a meeting led in a more traditional sense, right?
Yes. And what your deep processors are typically so much more aware of than any other type is what the system allows, what the system rewards, right? What the system punishes.
Hmm.
So the hesitation is in part because, again, they're thinking, am I going to be able to contribute my best thinking here? But is it safe to actually do this?
Right.
And is it safe to contribute my kind of thinking here?
Right. Yeah. You've talked about how the brain, I'm going to misquote you, but you can correct me, but the brain is looking for psychological safety. How did you phrase that the last time?
Yeah, so I actually attach neuro to the front of it, indicating that there's a neurological response first
Right.
before we're consciously then deciding it is safe or it is not safe. And
Right.
so the nervous system, right, again, from all the subtle, even nonverbal signals that the system is sending and that deep processors Typically also, the highly sensitive or the neurodivergent are picking up in the system of going, okay, I see that so and so is getting rewarded for that. Like, I know that my style, or I'm assuming, right, that my style is then not appreciated, not desired,
Right.
and have hesitation for that reason. So
Hmm.
it is neuropsychological safety that we're seeking to create more specifically.
Thank you. And lastly, yellow meetings.
Yellow meetings focus on planning and process. So
Yuck.
project planning, the scope, right?
Yeah.
Budget, process improvement, systematic review. How are we getting from point A to point B? What are literally the 10 steps, right? Or whatever it is in between our, desired, our current state and our desired future state. So we definitely want to use structured agendas with clear timelines and deliverables. And this is where, the blue exploration, right, then gets put into a practical terms, right? It's like, that's great. We have this big idea and we understand the why, and we're all, in our green meeting, we are on board with it. Let's move forward. And then yellow is like, well, how are we actually going to do that?
Yeah.
How are we going to make this a reality? So, what is the step-by-step process, and implementation planning is what's happening in a yellow meeting.
I had a visceral response when you mentioned yellow meetings, and it got me thinking that each person is going to have one meeting color that they love, and they're going to have some that they can live with, and some that it's, oh, I'll tell you, the yellow meeting, it's like, is there a way that I can miss this meeting? Because that's not the detail. It's not what I love to focus on. And I used to pride myself in hiring great people that were really detailed, structures and operation focused because it wasn't me. So how do you communicate which type of meeting it is?
Yes. So again, pre-meeting communication, it's key. Color coding it literally on a calendar, just using the word. This is a blue meeting. So come prepared to dive deep, explore your thinking, and expand it, right? Like, use language to signal to everyone what is expected and what you need to prepare for, how to show up, right? And then during the meeting, facilitate according to the colors strengths.
Right.
Post meeting follow up should match, right, the colors style.
Okay. So that's the theory. I love the structure, but can you give me a
Yeah.
real world example of how kind of this plays out?
Yes. So let's take, say, quarterly planning.
Mhm.
Traditionally, a very fast paced discussion that favors quick thinkers. We're trying to achieve a lot in maybe a short amount of time, where we have everyone from all the places, right, in this meeting. We've got to maximize it, right? Because this is the, one time out of the quarter, we're going to have
Yep.
all 10 of our leaders in the same room.
Yep.
So using the blue meeting approach, pre-work packets, processing time built into the session, analytical contributions are actually signaled as valued, and we can then get strategic insights from the deep processors to enhance our planning quality and prevent, like, those longer term downstream and some usually costly oversights.
Yeah, I led a lot of blue meetings. The way that you just described that quarterly session, absolutely saw a lot of them, led a lot of them, was involved in a lot of them. But we also deal in business, especially the ones that I've been involved with over the years, where, and I'll call it crisis management. Stuff happens, whether it's a, operational issue, whether it's a competitor challenge, whether it's a regulatory challenge. Speed is essential in those situations. What do we do there?
Sure. That is a red meeting that's had blue input. So the
Okay.
solution is rapid, structured input gathering, like
Okay.
a 2-minute written assessment before the
Okay.
verbal discussion. So again, like leveraging those sticky notes. And then systems thinkers provide the risk assessment, action oriented type. Those people drive implementation. And so you get both speed and thoroughness. And I think of in any, like, if, say, an evacuation plan simply for your building, what happens if there's a fire or an earthquake,
Right.
etc. The plan is something you execute quickly, but the plan came from, right, strategic foresight. We didn't whip up the plan and take action against that plan in the same meeting. So there was blue input, there was yellow input, even green input then of like who's going to be responsible for executing against it, who are the owners, right, of this like crisis management plan. And then once you're in that moment, it's like, yes, we want to act red. We want to be decisive. And again, we're not debating the plan. We've made the plan. We're now executing against the plan.
There's often times where, you're dealing with an opportunity and you want to get everybody's ideas to the table and you want to kind of promote, brainstorming. You want to get people, okay, listen, there's, clear sheet of paper, no rules. Basically, this is what we need to get to go. How do we facilitate that?
Yes. So that is a green meeting. So,
Okay.
and instead of typically what we do is a popcorn style, like idea sharing that again favors verbal processors,
Mhm.
we can use structured creativity in the silent brainstorming, right? Just small moments, right? Timed. So we can still move from point A to point B rather quickly. So moving from silent brainstorming, some sticky notes is the easiest example, to working in small groups for refinement, like breaking the groups up. And so that way, again, it feels safer to talk to one or two people than to talk 1 to 10 people. And then you move, though, once you have that small group refinement, then you can move into large group sharing. So it's building, right, blocks that gets everyone's brain to that comfortable place where they can then contribute their ideas to the bigger group. And the multiple idea capture methods honor all of the different processing styles.
So would that be a situation where you might, have kind of different, you'd create groups based on one approach versus another approach and let people kind of brainstorm in a smaller group that way, then bring their ideas forward? Is that what you're suggesting?
The green meeting is adjacent to blue meetings,
Right,
right? In that there is that kind of expansive thinking and less so like decisions made, unlike red and yellow meetings where you are
right.
making decisions. So it is naturally going to bring out those two groups who have those cognitive needs. And it's just in the still planning of that meeting for the yellows and reds where you're like, we're moving from point A to point B in this time chunk and point B to point C in this time chunk and C to D. And ultimately, this is where we're ending up that helps calm those brains, right? And
Right.
puts them in a toward state. So you can still articulate, right, with what you're doing and the pre-meeting planning, how you're then accommodating all of the different processing styles.
Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking about is how different people engage and how comfortable they are in large versus smaller groups and so forth. And so I guess what I'm curious is if I've got a group of, let's say we got 15 to 20 people in a meeting and it's based on brainstorming and so forth, is everybody going to feel comfortable to, throw ideas forward? Or, as I mentioned, is it
Mm.
better to break into smaller groups so that there's that, focus in one particular area of brainstorming and then bring it together? And maybe I'm going in too deep, but I'm just curious if there's a benefit of doing it that way.
Absolutely. And that's the process, right, of how you capture multiple ideas. The
Right,
first is silent brainstorming. So that's solo work, just me
right, right,
able to go into the recesses of my mind and write, right, what's coming to mind. Then from there, you are in smaller groups because it does feel safer to talk to a few people, right? It's vulnerable, but less so, right? To talk to a smaller group first
right.
and to get feedback from just a handful of folks instead of large group share, instead of moving to large group
Yeah.
share immediately and expecting that to work. There will only be a very few, right, percentage who are totally fine with that. Again, shoot up their hands and say whatever for as long as they want to, right, in front of any size
Yeah.
group. But that's not typical, especially with new ideas. Right. If you're talking about a new project or you're solutioning for something that we haven't solved for before,
Yeah.
that's all just risk and stress and vulnerability that
Yeah.
all brains, right, need to be worked into and
Especially
up to.
depending on the audience, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Sarah, one of the challenges that, I've faced over the years is dealing with different social styles and recognizing, true engagement versus disengagement. Who's engaged in a meeting, who's not engaged in a meeting, and so forth. So, how do you help leaders see the difference?
That is so crucial because we need to really redefine participation. Verbal engagement isn't the only form of cognitive engagement. Right? Active listening is a valuable and undervalued contribution. So the person who seems quiet might actually be doing really deep thinking and not be disengaged.
So, what are some of the environmental factors that, affect the different brain types in this situation?
Sure. From in the environment, the room setup, the noise level. Are you in this open space where there's a lot of commotion? Are you in a quieter space that allows for more focus? Lighting dramatically impacts different brains, right? So the person who, again, seems distracted might actually just be naturally overwhelmed by sensory input that others don't even notice.
The humming light, right?
Yes,
You know,
yeah, that the fluorescent light.
yeah,
Everybody complains about the fluorescent
yeah.
light, and that yet it's everywhere.
Yeah. So how do we create, I'll call it pathways for the, contribution? Because
Mm.
you talked about something there as that driver who, and again, I'm more of an expressive, but as that person who thinks fast, comments fast, if I'm looking at somebody who is in deep processing and they're not engaging, I'm kind of feeling they're not engaged. And whereas you say that no, they actually may be, but they're just in the throes of deep processing. How do I, how should I manage that? And how do I then bridge them into the conversation, like create that pathway?
During meetings, varied discussion formats, like we were just talking about, small groups, written reflection, structured debate, right? Time bound debate, post meeting follow up. We use that to capture insights from the processors who needed time, who are taking in everything during the meeting. And then as they assess all of that, right, and analyze it, can then come after the meeting that there's a place, an opportunity for them to contribute their synthesized ideas. So we just ongoing feedback loops, right? Because different types prefer to give input differently.
So I'm thinking of team dynamics because, you have, the analytical processor and, the more direct thinking out loud type of individual. Or what, maybe let me phrase it this way. What happens to team dynamics when analytical processors, don't get that processing time they need? And yet I still want them to be engaged.
No, you lose strategic thinking, you lose risk assessment, you lose pattern recognition. The team may make faster decisions, but they're often lower quality decisions
Mhm.
because we're not thinking in systems when we make really fast decisions. We're not thinking about, again, the first, second, third order effects of decisions that we make now. That we may think, oh, this is a great idea. It's going to solve this and this. Like that's a first order effect. We need to think about downstream effects, and that type of thinking just takes time for everybody, but it's something that the analytical processors, the deep thinkers, they do that naturally. That's how they think, is in systems.
Mhm.
And it's like when we just think in fast decisions, right? It's like having an excellent security system, but turning it off because it slows down entry.
So how do you manage, or how do leaders manage the loudest voice wins dynamic? And I say that because I'm sure that early, especially early in my career, I might have been that guy. And, I came to become aware, and also at more senior levels, it wasn't my responsibility to be speaking all the time, and my other teams did. But I had people on my teams that were the loudest voices. My directors would speak up. And I now, in hindsight, think that, there was probably missed opportunities to, get the best decision because we didn't do an effective job in gathering all input.
Yeah, you just said the word, right? Awareness.
Yeah.
awareness of our own tendencies, right? Our own needs. How do we usually show up? What's our preference? What's our natural style? And are we adapting that, right, for the context? Because
Mhm.
anyone's strength is only a strength in the right context. And we tend to overuse our strengths. And we forget that it's important to, even though we have a natural style and we want to lean into that because it's easiest, right? And so it's less cognitive load to lean into our natural style or lean into our strengths, that we do have to be adaptable and we need to learn what the other styles are like and how to shift right into those styles for the context. And then power dynamics, right? The awareness of power dynamics, understanding how hierarchy affects nervous systems. The power dynamics in a system, I think, mostly go wholly ignored, and in terms of how we build psychological safe cultures, that we're forgetting that just introducing a ranking system introduces threat and decreases safety. And we have these hierarchies for decision making, theoretically, right? It's just to be able to make decisions with ease, if there's somebody responsible, right, and accountable to output, right, in some segment, right, of the organization. But it can very easily just turn into a ineffective ranking exercise.
Yeah.
And the brain hates that. So cognitive democratization, right, is what we're looking for, and just ensuring that all of our thinking styles have the ability to influence outcomes.
Yeah, I can think of times when I needed to operate more as a deep thinker, more of an analytic, and how much brain power that caused me to use versus, my traditional approach, which it does speak to, cognitive overload, as you call it. When you're working with teams on meeting optimization, what's the biggest resistance you encounter?
We don't have time.
Yeah. Really? I've never heard that. Never said that.
Yeah, right. What I have to show them is that just spending 10 extra minutes in planning, like
Mhm.
setting an agenda, sending an agenda, creating some structure for the meeting, even if you didn't send out the agenda, but just identifying the structure of the meeting and how you're going to move from point A to B to C, that prevents hours rework from decisions that missed critical perspectives.
Yeah. So from a cognitive diversity perspective, what are we missing when we rush decisions?
We're missing the analytical systems, creative, sensitive, emotional perspectives that catch risks that others don't see. So
Yeah.
again, like the sensitive processors, the ones who are consciously picking up on subtleties in their environment,
Yeah.
who can read a stakeholder's reaction early and accurately. And the systems thinkers who see unintended consequences, right, are downstream effects. Speed without intelligence isn't efficiency, it's just expensive.
So when you're facilitating meetings with different social styles, what's your biggest challenge in getting everyone's input?
It's really, I'm finding, just creating the space for the deep processors, the analytical types, creative thinkers, get out of the box. And I also have started to use this terminology, like the paradigm shifters,
Mhm.
right? Those types. We need to create space for those types without losing the drivers
Mhm.
who want to move to action.
Mhm.
And the color coding system solves this by setting expectations up front about what type of thinking the meeting requires.
Yeah, I still found that there were times when I had that deeper thinker, and maybe it goes back to your hierarchical piece, that they were given the time, they were given the information, but they didn't always still want to speak up. And I tried to find ways to speak to them outside the meeting to almost encourage them in meetings to speak up. But what was really interesting, and it comes back to your point about time, is that, yeah, it took a lot of time and effort, but I only had to do it once or twice. And in the future, they were actively involved because I think maybe to your point, and I wasn't doing it consciously because I wasn't aware of this Berkman method, but I was creating some of these environments. And once I did, I can definitely see the value and impact because I did it unconsciously without structure. And with this structure, it would be, pretty significant.
Yeah. And I think what you're tapping into is really important, is that you can habitualize this pretty quickly, right? Just sending a few signals and repeating some simple
Right.
tasks, right? Like if you habitualize agendas, they can start out, pretty crappy at first, but you're just doing one. And even that then signals to others in the organization, oh, okay, like I can frame, right, my ever expanding mind around this task. This is the task at hand. And that just increases the meeting's, potential and its success.
So how do you help leaders recognize the difference between someone who is, say, disengaged versus someone who is, deeply processing?
We need to look for engagement signals beyond talking. So, is that person taking notes, making eye contact? Are they on their phone or not? Probably not, right? It's not under the table, right? They're not multitasking. Do they ask questions versus making statements, right? Like asking clarifying questions means they are taking in the information and processing it deeply enough to ask they've synthesized and then are asking a clarifying question. So deep processors often show engagement through fewer, higher quality questions rather than quick comments or statements.
Sira, one of the things that we've both focused a lot on is we can talk, in theory and detail and provide specific examples and so forth. But we also want to give, people that are listening an opportunity to actually take some of this stuff and do it. What are some immediate implementation steps that leaders can take this week? Kind of what can they do after they listen?
Definitely. Three things. First, conduct a meeting audit. This is one of the things that I do in my work with clients. And we assess current meetings for cognitive accessibility using the color framework. Second, we can just color code next week's meetings, right? And communicate the type to participate, right? You can just take one meeting you own, one color you like, right? Just one agenda. And just notice how a few design changes can unlock greater access to your human potential.
So you got a leader who listens to this and starts to do that, but what are some advanced strategies or next steps that they can take?
Yes. Okay. More advanced meeting role rotation. So getting people to participate in a leadership role, leveraging different cognitive strengths for different meeting types. Hybrid formats is another way where you can combine synchronous and asynchronous input, because we're working in different time zones. We're not as co-located as we were before. And, a cultural shift, on the largest scale, right? The systems shift is that meeting as a way to like measure performance, or meetings as performance, to meetings are for optimization, right? It's for leveraging the intelligence that we have already.
This is really a fundamental shift, though, in how we think about meetings.
Yes. And we are moving from forcing everyone to adapt to one meeting style, which has historically been compressing all of these different types into a single meeting, not allowing enough time for the meeting, having too many people at the meeting, all of these things, to designing meetings that unlock everyone's cognitive potential. And this, in my view, why I'm so passionate about it, is like, this has to happen. Our meetings must become precision instruments for collaboration, because gathering effectively is how we connect with each other. It's how we build trust and ultimately earn loyalty.
I think about it as a sales guy, thinking, how do I sell this to, those fast processors and so forth? And it's really got to be focused on, are you happy with the effectiveness of your meetings? Are you happy with the impact of your meetings? Are your meetings time well spent? And how would you feel if we could devise a structure and a strategy to help increase not only the effectiveness and impact, but the engagement of your teams? That would just to me
Mhm.
be a great way to pitch it to people like me who are looking at it going, wow, this is a lot of work. We've covered creating inclusive systems for cognitive diversity. Once leaders understand how to optimize meetings, so but what is like the next challenge?
Yes, because that is while everyone has meetings, right? Every organization has meetings, and we have all different types of meetings. It's still one piece, right, of this organizational system and all of its complexity. So now that we understand how to create inclusive spaces
Mhm.
where we gather meetings for all cognitive types, the question then becomes how do leaders who think differently show up authentically
Mhm.
and confidently? And we talked a bit about how, existing leaders can create the conditions for that. But in my view, traditional like executive presence models often work against the strengths of deep processors, sensitive, creative, and like paradigm shifting leaders.
So we should probably then focus on authentic leadership presence in our next conversation.
Yes, we can explore how deep processing becomes strategic thinking, how sensitivity becomes emotional intelligence, and how authenticity in your leadership becomes your greatest leadership asset. And we're talking about moving from performing leadership
Mhm.
to really becoming the leader you were designed to be.
Well, that's perfect. So for our leaders, I encourage you to color code one meeting this week and adjust your facilitation accordingly. Then, after the meeting, take a few moments to do two things. One, ask yourself, what went well? Was there a noticeable change in engagement? And what comments and feedback did I get from the team? And second, engage, a couple of your deeper processors one-on-one and ask them what they thought about this new meeting approach. What do you think of that?
I love it. Yes, I wish everyone would go out and do that tomorrow. Thank you, Tony. This has been great.
Yes. Always wonderful talking to you, Sarah. Thank you.
See you soon.